the title, Custom and Practice Revisited, I should warn you, and I inherited this from my father, that I find it very difficult to resist a pun, or at least a double entendre, and there was one in the title of this talk. Because custom and practice means two different things. It means most normally that which is usually done, the usual way of doing things. The custom and practice in this place is I don't let women go through first, or we do certain things before we do certain other things. But it also is meant to mean custom in the sense of customers, and practice in the sense of professional practice. So I was interested in that from the point of view of an operational researcher. Somewhat dyed in the wool by the time that I wrote this. And it's revisited, Custom and Practice Revisited, because it is the title of a paper I wrote in the Journal of the Operational Research Society just over 25 years ago. And actually that was my presidential address as president of the Operational Research Society. But in order to address this subject properly, and there's a certain amount of self-indulgence in this, I need to go back further than 25 years, in fact 50 years, because the question is, why did I get to give a presidential address? In other words, why was I president of the Operational Research Society? A result which seemed very unlikely until very shortly before it happened. I never stood for office in the Operational Research Society. I never served on its council. And the first office I stood for was that of president, which is not the normal way of doing things in our organization. The backstory is this. There's rather more here than I'm going to be able to go through in detail, but in 1961 I joined Stafford Beer's group at United Steels in Sidewall House. It was Cybernetics and OR for Operational Research. And that was my entry into operational research. Unfortunately, I arrived on the Monday and Stafford Beer had left the previous Friday to go and set up Sigma. It took me a couple of years before I got down there. It is relevant to mention that I got all my life I've been involved in one form or another of politics. And I was a Labour Party candidate in the 1966 election, for South Kensington, I should say, not the most profitable area. And I did intend to become Prime Minister sometime later, but in fact, instead I resigned from the Labour Party. So that's one kind of politics. Another kind of politics, which is perhaps slightly more relevant, is that when I was in Pennsylvania, University of Pennsylvania in 1967, there was a fuss on campus about chemical and biological warfare research being done there, which was being applied in Vietnam. And as a result of my writing a piece about that for a British weekly journal, I got involved in numbers of people who were worried about the misuse of science, and that became the British Society for Social Responsibility in Science, which I was in for 20 years. I was also had a job to do, but I reckon I was spending about 50% of my time on that and 50% of time on trying to make sure I didn't get sacked by publishing enough papers and so on. The thing I found, to my surprise, was I kept meeting operational researchers in this radical science organization. And eventually we thought, well, here we are, we're operational researchers. We're saying all sorts of things about how science should be used in other areas. What about our own science? Shouldn't we be worried about whether that is being used appropriately? And we thought, well, how can we take that argument forward? And at the level of theory, we didn't get very far. So we thought, how about the level of practice? Which was that there was an ongoing dispute in the British Operational Research Society. And we thought, can we make an intervention in this dispute? And the dispute was about something called the Register of Practitioners, which was the result of a reorganization of the Operational Research Society by Stafford Beer, who had been president shortly before. And he threw the whole thing up in the air and changed all the committees and said that it should be professionalized. And there were numbers of people who were not happy about that, and we said, why don't we try and articulate what our concerns are about turning this into a proper top-down professional organization with grades of membership, such as is common in engineering, for example. There was a worry about it fossilizing the syllabus being a control structure over new recruits and things like that. And indeed, it was a very successful intervention, and the society threw out the proposal by a majority of 4-1, and we were seen as the people who'd argued against it, and therefore we were seen as having hundreds, at least if not thousands, of anarcho-Trotskyites right behind us. The then president, because by this time Stafford moved on, was a guy called Keith Tocker, who was a father figure of computer simulation. He actually gave an interview in which he accused us all of being anarcho-Trotskyists, although there was a great contradiction between those two terms. Anyhow, so that's where it might have lain. But in 1984, I think it was, I received a phone call from the guy who was then secretary of the Operational Research Society, a guy called Jim Farmer, saying they're at it again. Namely, they're starting to start up the professionalisation again. This was after an interval of 12 years or so. And what had happened was that a guy called Brian Haley, who's a professor at Birmingham, had been president, and he passed over to the next president, who was a guy called Roy Stainton. And they were both in favour. They were trying to bring in elements of professionalism via the side door and not the back door. And he said, "You've got to do something about it, Jonathan." So I waited him to do something about it, and he didn't. So I then collected various signatures and got myself put on the ballot, mostly just to stop them from doing it. There was then an electoral campaign, because very unusually, there was more than one candidate. And therefore we had a chance of putting forward an election manifesto. And on one occasion, for reasons which need not concern us here, I was stuck in Houston airport for about 10 hours, my wife having departed on an earlier plane and my waiting for the plane that I was booked on. After I'd explored all the little underground railway systems they had between terminals, I got rather bored. And I could write my election address here, so I did. So I had this sort of 8 hours of uninterrupted time to write an address saying why people should vote for me. So we're going to get to that election manifesto in a moment. But first of all, I thought I should dramatise the passage of time by some visuals. They're all clustered together, I'm afraid, one after the other. But this will show you how much time has changed. So if you look very carefully there, you'll see me. See if I can, that's me there. I'm about to be arrested by one of those policemen immediately behind me. That was on the steps of St. Martin's in the Fields, and it was the day after the Sharpeville massacres in 1960. And we went to protest as near as we could get to South Africa House. And that was, I think, the first time I ever got arrested. So keep that image in your head as we move on. Let's see what we can find in the next one. That is me as parliamentary candidate in 1966, with some very distinguished people on the platform with me, which was took some doing. Anyhow, that's the second one. What's the third one I want? Oh, yeah, there I am. That's 1970, and I'm just being bundled into what I think may be the back of a police van. We were protesting there about visiting a team of the British cricket team, which was about to visit South Africa. It was either 69, 70 or 71, I can't remember. And we put our cars to block the car park to stop the bus getting out to go to the airport. So that's another part of the history, and it's all in chronological order. You can notice the hairstyles change as we go through. I don't know what date that is. I happened to find it, I thought it was too good to waste. It's but I think it's probably about 1980, 1981. That's when I got elected president of the Operational Research Society. I couldn't quite do it with the hair anymore for various reasons. I think that's all I've got in the way of visuals. That's the up to about, that's 25 years ago. So that's the first 25 years in moving pictures. Let's go on. Here's the manifesto that I wrote in 1984. That's much too long, so I'm going to advance it by one. To pick out the things in red that's the most significant there. I said that if elected, I would try to find a more significant social role for operational research. We would need to expand the range of operational research's clients beyond those that are conventional, and we should work on larger and messier problems. So this, as we foreshadowed the direction that I took in the election address, which of course I got to write because I was elected. So there was this election. There were actually three candidates. There was a guy called Martin Beale, who was a fellow of the Royal Society and was the elite candidate, and there was a guy called Frank Liness, who was a manager in the gas industry, and he was the practitioner's candidate. And then there was whatever I was, the third one, and I got 43% of the vote and got elected. So it wasn't a complete majority, but then Margaret actually got 43% of the vote too. So it seems to be legitimate. There had not, as far as I know, been an election for the RSLD presidency in its previous history, nor has there been one since. But on that, it's like a number 49 bus. Three came along at once. What we have here is the front page of the actual election list, which of course the presidential address, which gets printed in the journal, is a copy of it, but I can't go through all the pages, so I'm going to talk around it rather than anything else. So that dates from, I think, 1984, and I will put some more recent readings on some of the transparencies, in case anybody wants the presentation afterwards, and then you can. Rereading it, which I did for this talk, I realised that not all of it was deadly serious. Some of it was provocation. People say you should keep politics out of operational research, is one of the phrases, and I said you can't, because politics isn't everything. I told the story of an article I wrote about my daughter, which was printed in the Journal of the Operational Research Society. That was actually my stepdaughter, about her education. And it was using a technique that I developed called robustness analysis. And when the proofs came back to me, it was accepted, and proofs came back to me, but everywhere I'd written she had been changed to he. And I wrote to Brian Haley, the same Brian Haley, who was editor of the journal at that stage, and said that some crazy proofreader or sub-editor has changed all these she's to he's. And he said, no, that was me, I did it. And he said, I did it because the house style of the journal is that all decision makers are male. So there was a standoff for a time, and then eventually it was agreed that it could go in with she's, provided there was a little asterisk, and you'll find it on the article. Down at the bottom of the front page it says, very similar methods would work for a boy. So that was put in. There was the longer stuff about the lack of feminist sensitivity in the operational research community. That was just a part of all that, but I hadn't got time for the other main joke, which I put in there. But it was an indication of an organisation which wasn't perhaps keeping up with all of the things, the ways in which society was changing. Going back to the title, the first words in the paper are, the subject of this address, custom and practice, covers the question of who OR works for, custom, and as well as what we do and how we do it, which is practice. So in fact there are actually three things. Although it's custom and practice is two, there are three. There's who we work for, what we do, and how we do it. The way in which the paper worked forward was to say that in dealing with our customers we should try to be focusing on community groups as an additional sort of clientele. In terms of methods, we should be trying to find more participative methods. And in terms of problems, we should be looking at pressing social issues rather than more tactical problems of management at whatever level. So I'm going to go through those three, customers, methods, and problems, hopefully not taking too long with any one of them. Those are the sorts of people that operational research works for. I don't know if they're the sort of people, systems persons who have a practical involvement also work for. But this was absolutely dominant. These were the people you worked for, and somebody could almost give you a thrill by giving a paper in which they worked for a really big organization. So something which might not be that I remember Ross Acuff talking about some work he'd done for the biggest aluminium company in the world, and that somehow made it much more interesting and more significant than if he'd done it for a little sort of backstreet organization. So there was a sense that we got our importance from the power of our clientele, and indeed this was so pervasive that it was very hard. It was an effort for operational researchers to think who else they could possibly work for. These were the people that operational research could work for. What else, after all, is out there? And here were some of the things that we could work for and help them with their decisions. And that is actually a set of organizations which had been identified by a guy called Steve Cook, who was a vice president of the Operational Research Society. He had been in operational research during the war, and he's one of the quite radical people, because operational research during the war was full of leftists, as it happens. And he was head of operational research at the Steel Company of Wales. So he was a man very much rooted in the subject, and he was saying we could be working for these people as well. But it didn't get much noticed at that time. So once I was elected on this manifesto, I needed to persuade council that they should do something serious about extending the range of our customers, our clients. And there was resistance, particularly from the treasurer, as you can imagine. For those who know anything about operations, that was Maurice Shuttler, who incidentally was also a visiting professor in the place where I work, LSE. So there we were actually on two opposite sides of the argument, on most things, in fact, and actually he's a very nice guy, and I'm not too awful. So we got on quite well, but there was this big struggle. But in the end, the Operational Research Society made the biggest financial commitment that it's ever done to set up supported units, initially at Northern College, which is outside Barnsley. It's a residential college of adult education. So people from disadvantaged groups were coming in and being there for weeks at a time and being helped with their problems. They were being given whatever intellectual fodder they needed, but also some assistance with their practical problems. So it was a very good place for finding clients. And when that eventually ceased, the Community Operational Research Unit moved to the University of Lincoln, where it still is functioning. And for a time, Hull University had a Centre for Community OR, which is part of the Centre for System Studies there. And that also received a certain amount of Operational Research Society funding. So this idea, which came out of, well, it didn't actually come out of Houston Airport. The idea came out of the fact that I'd been working with the British Society of Social Responsibility in Science for many previous years. And the ideas about participation, about control structures, about empowerment were present in the ambience in which I was working. And eventually it was borne in on me that people like me ought to be applying it to our own practice and not just blaming other people. So these ideas which I put into the presidential address were not my ideas, they were community's ideas. Community OR then is still running, and it's 25 years on, and that's actually not usual for a presidential address of the Operational Research Society. It's very hard to see anything much that's been changed by any other presidential address, because that's not what they're for. They're for the celebration of and rumination, but they're not for programs of practice. So we had to decide who we would work with, and so we said there was a working group which set up a definition of who we would work with, and we'd work with groups which existed to protect or advance the interests of their members, weren't wealthy, didn't own property, didn't operate through a management hierarchy with people with defined roles, and operated through consensus or democracy. So we were trying to, it hasn't always been possible to work precisely with that sort of organization, but that was our aim. So it was operational research in support of grassroots democratic decision-making by the disadvantaged. What we didn't know was if anybody would come. So we put up our sign, put up our shingle, or whatever the Americans say, and waited to see if anybody would come. And in fact, they did. I think, though I'm not quite sure, that that's the list of some of the types of organization that came and that the unit worked within the first year. It might be the first 2 years, I'm not certain. So the wide range of different sorts of groups who met that description pretty well, who had problems which were susceptible to some kind of analytic assistance, not obviously using mathematical programming to find an optimum, but helping them to understand the structure of their problem situation, consider their alternative options, and allow them to have a better grasp of where they might wish to go, and have a better discussion among themselves to reach consensus. Of course, we couldn't use linear programming or dynamic programming or any other sort of programming to do this, so that we were not able to use the traditional methods of operational research, which is where the different clientele links across to the different methods that are necessary if you're going to work with groups of this kind. If you want to read more about community OR, then there's reading there. Gerald Midgley at the University of Hull now has written the fullest book. My article is just an analysis of the similarities between community operational research and operational research for development in third world countries, because there are a lot of parallels. And interestingly enough, the book at the bottom is a very new, as you can see, US publication, and Michael Johnson's a very interesting guy, and he's come across community OR work from Britain. I don't think we inspired him. I think he started off by himself, and he calls it community-based operational research, and he says it's altogether less radical than what the British operational researchers are doing, but he finds the ideas that we've generated and the example extremely useful to him. So the unit at Lincoln is still there and is quite busy. It's got probably a narrower client base than the one at Northern College used to have. There's less buzz in the operational research world about it. There was a time when there was I can't remember how often it came out, a magazine called Acorn. COR in the middle stands for Community OR, so it was called Acorn. There was a Community OR network of volunteers who worked with groups of this kind. So most of that has fallen away, but there's still a Community OR stream at the annual conference of the Operational Research Society, and has been for at least the last dozen years, and that's continuing. So let's move on. First, this question of methods, problem structuring methods, is what this is going to be about. Methods which are not like the data-heavy, computation-heavy methods that operational research was noted for. Because the standard operational research techniques, I'm not sure how many of these will be familiar to you. If not, there's no need to worry about that. But there are quite a lot of them. There's a whole repertoire, a whole tool bag of techniques which people learn in master's degrees. These are the standard techniques of hard operational research. We distinguish now between soft operational research and hard operational research, which is different, because 25 years ago there was only operational research and it was hard. And now there are these two branches which are nowadays in friendly communication with each other, and indeed sometimes one uses the methods in a mixture. And there are people who use both, even if separately, but feel quite happy to have the soft methods in their tool bag as well as the hard ones. But those are the ones that are still the dominant ones, the ones that are mostly used and mostly known. The practical achievements are many. There are things without which the trains wouldn't run on time, and the airlines wouldn't have their crew rostering sorted out adequately, and many useful things that are done by operational research and keep the wheels of large organizations turning with at least with greater efficiency than they would do if they didn't have them. The critique of people like myself of hard operational research was quite stringent. and this comes across in the paper that I wrote 25 years ago, that this traditional hard operational research is managerialist in kind, positivist in its approach to knowledge, that only things that are measured or measurable are worth considering. There's only seen to be one perspective on any problem, and that is the perspective of the unitary decision maker, who will then take decisions through a chain of command, and it will be implemented through a standard hierarchical organization. So that's the sort of our view that hard OR, it's fair to say, I think we knew that wasn't the only way in which it actually was used, but that was the nature of the methods was they were particularly conducive to that sort of approach, and anybody who wanted to use it in a more sensible way was struggling against the nature of the methods. The methods didn't help. So we felt that it was arguable that hard OR was suitable for traditional clients only for some of their problems. If you got up to the board level, you were very unlikely to find that they would want an optimizing method for anything that they had to decide on. And it was a complete barrier for engagement with this sort of alternative clientele that we were thinking of by that stage. And it tended to serve top-down control rather than democratic decision-making, partly because it's based on the idea that somebody up top taking decisions and the person at the top sets the objectives. But also because it was very hard for anyone to understand what the method was. So that even a senior decision maker would not actually be able to fully grasp whether the method had been appropriately applied or not, which meant that the top decision makers tended to keep hard OR away from the really serious problems because that's the things that they needed to take responsibility for, and they couldn't afford to make a mistake. If a traveling salesman routine was badly programmed and gave bad results, so that would cause a little bit of disruption in the delivery system for the firm, but it wouldn't bring the firm down. They would then correct it. But if you do that at the strategic level, you might not have a firm at all. Well, there was a lot of dispute between hard OR-ers and soft OR-ers at the time. They're slinging insults at each other. Ross Acuff gave two papers at the OR Society conference. I imagine Ross Acuff is known to many people in the systems world. He was an OR person who defected to the other side, to the dark side of systems. And one of the papers he gave at the OR Society annual conference, he castigated basically the only operational research he really knew at the time as mathematically sophisticated but contextually naive. That is actually one of the nicer things he said. The one that caused most uproar was, I think, when he called it mathematical masturbation. That is, it has really no connection with productive activities. Robert Maycoll was but they both actually were presidents of the American Operational Research Society. Robert Maycoll somewhat later than Ross Acuff. And Maycoll said of an early problem structuring methods paper, it's time to stand up and shout that the emperor isn't wearing any clothes. There's no content in any of this. This is a paper by a guy called Colin Eden, who was at Bath University and for many years has been at the Strathclyde Business School, in fact, head of the business school. I mean, very. He was head of the graduate business school as well. Graduate business school, yes. So, very distinguished person, but not recognized in his early days by Robert Maycoll. 30 years later, things are very different. This is Richard Iglesias, who's just ceased to be the president of the UK Operational Research Society, writing last year, saying methodologies for problem structuring, read problem structuring methods, which is what we call this family of participative methods, have been taught in postgraduate OR courses for many years and continue to evolve. That is, it's part of the standard repertoire. So peace has broken out. Basically, Richard Iglesias is a mathematical programmer as well as president of the Operational Research Society. And this would represent, I think, a consensus view in the British OR world, though not necessarily further afield. So what are these problem structuring methodologies? There are a family of model-based group decision support methods. They aim to structure complexity rather than to solve problems. They try and put a structure that so that people can understand the problems they're faced with better. They're generally used in a group situation, in a workshop, which is facilitated by somebody who knows the method and is sensitive to the dynamics of the group. So they are helped to use the method by somebody who knows it. The model structure is developed interactively by the group with the help of the facilitator. And there are tools within the methods to encourage the participation of members, so they build the model, in effect, together. And in the building of the model, they generate a commitment to the fact that that model represents their joint understanding of the situation that they have to make some decisions about. And in the process, they will develop, one hopes, commitment to the actions which follow from that model, that representation of the factors that they are struggling with. The problem structuring methods, or PSMs, tend to be used when you've got muddy goals, you don't know what they are, you maybe have to find out who the stakeholders are. Lots of things that are important can't be, unfortunately, be measured. Things about the situation may emerge during the process of investigation rather than be given at the beginning. So if you started modeling at the beginning, it might be modeling in a hard sense at the beginning, it might be a mistake because you'd be modeling what you then thought the problem was rather than what it became in the process of investigation. There are lots of uncertainties, including uncertainties about what other people will do, and so on and so on. So that is what Donald Schoen called, Donald Schoen called this the problem of the swamp, as opposed to the problems of the high ground. Hard operational research works on the high ground where you can do nice technical stuff with fancy footwork. And down in the swamp you can't do that. But that's where the important problems are. Rosenhead called these messes as opposed to problems. And a whole range of dichotomies like that that have been developed by different management writers. These, when I was growing up, because of course I was a hard operational researcher from 1961 to whenever it was, 1980. So for 20 years I was working within that previous paradigm. And what we would have said was, when we saw there was a problem like that, we said, that's not an OR problem. We have to leave that alone because that's for people who like getting their hands dirty and maybe politicians and smoke-filled rooms. But we don't want to have anything to do with that. We want to stay clean with measurements of things that everybody agrees are scientifically correct. So, the leading methods in problem structuring methods are soft systems methodology of Peter Checkland, which tends to deal with the design or redesign of systems. What I did, I used to teach with Peter Checkland, and sometimes I'd put this transparency up, and I would go around saying what each of them was for, and when I finished he would say, well, soft systems methodology does all of those things. But I think it's about system design and redesign. SODA is Colin Eden's approach. There were two versions, one of which is where you interview people individually and then put their maps together and then have a discussion. But they build cognitive maps of what they're thinking on the subject. And then there's the oval mapping technique, where you get together in a room and you do it with post-it notes, and you don't have that intervening stage of individual mapping. Strategic choice approach is John Friend's and is to do with the management of uncertainty. And mine is robustness analysis, which is very close to John Friend's, which is to do with operationalizing the idea of flexibility when you have uncertainty. There are lots of applications. There are some, I'm not going to go through all of those, but there are quite wide variation from major corporations like Shell or Sainsbury's supermarkets, governments, like that's the next to the bottom one, was the Netherlands government, and then we've got community groups in Tower Hamlets, so it can go from the top to the bottom. Yes, well, I could take a long time going through those. The references to that are mostly in a paper by Mingers and myself, John Mingers and myself, and the reading for that is going to come up in a minute, which is about applications of problem structuring methods. Most of those applications are UK-based or engaged UK practitioners, but it's not by any means limited to the UK, although we are still the major source of infection. But it's quite widespread in Europe, not in the United States, where they are very resistant. But it's also used quite widely in Venezuela. You may recognize Hugo Chavez. And the book that he's holding is, if you can translate the Spanish, is Planning Under Pressure, which is the book by John Friend on strategic choice. And that's a picture taken from the television. He has a television program, 4 hours every Sunday, called Allo Presidente. And on one occasion he held up this book and said, this is a book which every public servant in Venezuela should read. And he did it for the next 2 Sundays as well. So it was very good advertising. And this was a copy, a version that was translated in Venezuela into Spanish. And they also translated my survey book, which the second edition is with John Menges, called, what's it called? Rational Analysis for a Problematic World, Revisited. Revisited because it's the second edition. Yes, they're over there. And in Venezuela, it's been used quite up high up. It's been used by cabinet meetings. Not quite as John Friend might have prescribed, but some of the ideas at any rate are getting across and being used at a very strategic level indeed. Okay, so that's the second stage. We've done custom. We've done how we do what we do, but we haven't done what we do in terms of the nature of significant problems that might be worked on. I think some of the problems that have been worked on are more strategic than they were for hard operational research. We're getting into the top executive level of decision making in some of those organizations, but that's not the top level of social decision making by any means. What I said in the paper was that there were a number of quotes. The world is beset by overwhelming predicaments with a systemic aspect. Systems in crisis, possibly more intense than those of the 1930s. Little did I know how intense it could get. Why does OR effectively exclude itself from contributing to the resolution of major social problems? Our methods, unless severely modified, largely exclude OR from this involvement. So that's what I said 25 years ago. So what can we say about what OR's contribution has been? Okay, that's what I think it amounts to. A blank page. Now I did give a related talk, not quite the same, at Hull last month. And when I put this up, after a shocked silence, after a while in the question and answer, people were saying, no, we've done this, we've done that, we've done the other. So there were some suggestions of some work on significant social problems. But I think when you look at the scale of the potential, these are mostly minimal incursions into very significant areas. This is a list of global issues produced by the United Nations. I wanted to get the UN logo up there, but I failed, so my computer skills aren't quite up to it. That's a list of what they regard as global issues. And these are not really, these are problem areas rather than problems. You know, women, for example. But if you think about at that sort of level, OR's contribution to the sort of problems that most of us could intuit as existing within these different areas, OR hasn't really made any impact on them at all. Now, if you try and go from those into yes, terrorism?
No, well, yes.
Sorry.
Terrorism is one of the solutions.
Yeah, okay. Yes, yes. So which are we meaning of solution?
Well, I think democracy is often
yes, but democracy can also be a problem. Yes. Yeah. Or achieving democracy can be a problem. So there are various ways in which these things, you need a lot of interpretation to try and work out what the United Nations meant. Perhaps it was negotiated by a committee. I suspect so. But when I tried to think about this, I thought some of the problems that we haven't worked on, or at least not to any extent worthy of the name, are those sustainability, climate change, the drugs epidemic, health service reforms, the banking crisis, congestion charging. I mean, there are probably little elements of OR in some of these, but very, very little. And I'm sure that the etc. at the bottom you could all supply things to if I wasn't talking and interfering with your mind. All sorts of ideas would come of things that have got a systemic element and that you'd think that an OR contribution would be useful for. And I think we've simply failed to engage. And I think this probably applies to the systems community as well as the operational research community. But you could tell me whether that's true or not. We failed by having the wrong methods. We failed by being too abstract. We failed by wanting to stay in our ivory towers. There's all sorts of ways in which we failed. But the answer is that I think we've not done what the world, in some sense, would have benefited from. So I think that's more or less as far as I want to go. I just wanted to have a quick summary slide, just one to finish with, and then there'll be some time for questions and answers. My summary was that community OR is still alive. The OR community is less engaged with it maybe than it was. But then there's a hopeful sign there because the Operational Research Society has just set up something called ORITS, which is OR in the third sector. And this was an idea, so this is working with voluntary organizations rather than with community groups as such, an idea that came up at one of the Community OR conference streams at, about a year or two ago. So it was born out of community operational research. It was launched in September last year. It already has 120 volunteers working in a wide range of projects. So there is still people see the potential and the desire to work on socially relevant problems. I think perhaps these would be problems more at the base of society as opposed to the ones I was just talking about, which are much more all-enveloping. Problem structuring methods, I think, have taken great strides. It's only, well, the phrase problem structuring methods did not exist when I wrote that paper. And that you will not find it in my presidential address. It emerged with the publication of the book, Rational Analysis for a Problematic World, in 1987. So that was when we realized that there were actually already some methods that were participative in nature, and if we brought them all together, we would learn from each other, and people would realize we existed. So that's, if you like, how it happened quite quickly after my presidential address. And I think it wasn't altogether accidental because I'd given that address and now I thought I ought to do something about it, and I organized a book which brought the various methods together. And I think crystallized a community which still exists and is quite active in Britain especially, but also around the world. So I think it's really quite a substantial achievement over the 25 years. They're not easy to embed within organizations, because they tend to deal with exceptional situations rather than things that happen every day. And therefore, a lot of the work is done by consultants coming in and out, or by academics who are part-time consultants. And this is not perhaps an ideal situation. We could think of ways in which they could be embedded in organizations. And the second point is currently, precisely at this moment, academic traditionalists are being obstructive in this country and having some successes because of the REF, which used to be the RAE, and the listing of journals. If you're not publishing in a 4-star journal, you won't get promoted and you won't get submitted. And the 4-star journals are all American, and the Americans are not interested in problem structuring methods. So people are being given strong incentives to leave this field by some business schools that are trying to model themselves effectively on American business schools. So there is a threat at this precise moment, despite the 25 years of experience, and indeed a good deal of take-up by practitioners in ordinary organizations, people who carry these things now in their tool bags, having been, thousands of them have now been through MSc degrees and know about these methods. And thirdly, the world is still having to manage without OR's help on its most difficult problems, and it's not doing a very good job. I think that operational research has suffered and the world has not benefited. So there is still lots more scope in each of these areas, but over 25 years is very short, so these are early days, and I'm hopeful. Thank you.